Orchestrated Canadian story framework with new characters and Okanagan Vineyard setting. Orchestrated Canadian story framework with new characters and Okanagan Vineyard setting. Late September on Lake Okanagan, and the evening still held the day's warmth the way a stone fence does. Ashford Cellars had strung the long terrace above the vineyard with lights for the harvest gala, and the lake below had gone the color of pewter, flat and patient under the first stars. Reed Whitaker was crouched at the edge of the equipment yard finishing a job on the seized bearing of a press. Grease worked into the creases of his knuckles, his canvas jacket damp at the collar from a day that hadn't cooled until an hour ago. 8 months he'd been on the estate, long enough that nobody looked at him twice anymore, which was exactly how he wanted it. A guest's voice carried down off the terrace, loose with wine, saying something about how Cordelia Ashford could have any man in the valley she pointed at. Laughter. Then she was coming down the gravel path away from the noise, a glass of her own white untouched in her hand. And she slowed when she reached the spill of work light where he was kneeling. He said it before he'd decided to. Whoever ends up standing next to you is going to be the luckiest man in the Okanagan. She stopped. For a moment, there was only the tick of the cooling press and the small sounds of the lake. "I've been hoping that might be you," she said. Quiet. Almost lost under the music. Then she kept walking, down toward the water, and didn't look back. If that stopped you the way it stopped him, type the word "stay" in the comments before this goes any further. By 6:30 the next morning, the lake was hidden under fog, and the vine rows stood up out of it like the ribs of something half buried. Reed took the long way around the gala wreckage. The rental tables not yet collected, the lights still looped through the pergola, and went straight into the work shed. Gus Tremblay was already at the percolator. An old man who'd been pulling fruit off this slope since before Reed was born. Gus looked at him a beat longer than the morning called for, said nothing, poured a second mug of coffee black as creosote, and slid it down the bench. Reed drank it standing up. By 7 he was home. The little rented house sat on a side road above Naramata, close enough to the water that the air came in off the lake, smelling of cold stone and wood smoke. His daughter sat at the kitchen table in her school clothes, drawing a sailboat on the back of a flyer. She'd given it a square sail, which was wrong for the hole she'd drawn, and he loved her too much to tell her so before breakfast. "You came home late," Wren said, not looking up. "Press let go on me." "Just a press?" She glanced at him sideways. She was 7 going on 40. "Just a press, Daddy." "Just a press, Peanut." He said toast in front of her. She turned the pencil over and added a flag to the top of the mast. 14 kilometers south, in the glass office above the crush pad. Cordelia Ashford stood at the window with a coffee that had gone cold an hour before she remembered it was there. The vineyard fell away below her in long combed rows, and beyond it, the lake threw back a sky still working out what color it wanted to be. Her chief of staff knocked once and came in. Tobias Kane carried a tablet against his ribs and the careful expression of a man bringing news he didn't like. "Holt filed the Calverton agenda this morning," he said. "He's moving for a special shareholders meeting. 2 weeks. She nodded at the glass. "Cordelia, did you hear me?" She'd heard him. She didn't turn. After a moment he set the tablet on her desk and let himself out. She didn't look at the tablet. She looked instead at the photograph on the credenza. Her father at the tiller of the old wooden launch he'd built by hand, 12 years gone now, and a younger version of herself beside him squinting into the sun, her hand on his forearm the way a child holds on without knowing she's holding on. At noon she came down to the yard without an appointment. The shed door stood open and Reed was hunched over a cracked manifold, sleeves shoved up, a smear of oil along his jaw. He felt her before he saw her and got to his feet. "The list for the South Block tractors," she said. "I'd like it by Friday. You'll have it Thursday." She nodded. She didn't move. The yard went on around them. A forklift 2 rows over, a magpie scolding. The generator's low drone. None of it paused for either of them. "Anything else, Miss Ashford?" She looked at him for a long beat. "No," she said. "That's all." She turned to go and let him get 3 steps of distance before he said it. "I shouldn't have said what I said last night." She didn't turn around. "You think I'd have answered if you hadn't?" And then she was walking back up toward the office, and he stood there with a wrench in his fist for the better part of a minute before he sat down on an empty crate and put his face in his hands. Not because it hurt, because it didn't, and he couldn't, for the life of him, work out why it didn't. At the end of the shift, he stood at the edge of the lower terrace and watched the wind move across the lake in long, dark patches. Doff beside him and handed him a sweating can without being asked. "You wanted to say it," Gus said. "Didn't want to say it then. There's no good time for that kind of thing." "There isn't," Gus agreed, and they drank without talking until the lights came on along the far shore. The next morning, Cordelia stayed in her office past her usual hour. A stack of briefing memos sat untouched at her elbow. She crossed the room, lifted the photograph down off the credenza, and laid it flat on the desk as though it weighed more than it could. The launch in the picture had a name painted on the transom in her father's own hand, Northwind. And he told her once, at the bottling of the wine he'd named after the boat, that it was the finest thing the estate would ever put in a glass. She'd been 22. She'd asked who'd actually built the blend, since by then her father was too old and too shaky to work a lab bench, and he'd said the kid is too young to ruin with that kind of attention. She'd laughed. Her father hadn't. Tobias came in with the day's schedule and saw the photograph lying face up on the desk. "Whitaker," he said, as if it had just occurred to him. Gus mentioned once he used to be at a cellar down in the Similkameen. The good years. Cordelia didn't look up. How long ago? 12 years, give or take. Gus didn't seem to want to say more than that. She thanked him. She waited until the door clicked. Then she put her flat hand on the photograph and held it there, the way you hold something down so it can't rise. By midday, she was back at the yard. She walked past the work shed without stopping and found him in the long storage barn behind the crush pad, where the estate kept the equipment too old to use and too valued to scrap. The big doors were rolled open. Reed was crouched beside the Northwind itself. The launch had been up on a cradle under a tarp for years, running his thumb along a split in the planking. She didn't wait for him to stand. "You made the Northwind blend." He stayed where he was, one hand flat on the cradle, and rose up slow. "I made the Northwind blend." The afternoon light came through the open doors in a long slant full of floating dust, and outside a gull off the lake called and was answered. "My father chose you when you were 26, she said. "He did. He told me he couldn't name you because the attention would wreck you. He told me the same about staying quiet." She sat down on a stack of pallets like her legs had made the decision without consulting her. She didn't cry. She held very still, the way a person does when a swell comes up unexpected and they're deciding whether to brace into it or let it roll through. "You were going to run the wholesaler program," she said. "I was going to." "What happened?" He didn't say his wife's name. He said, "Nora got sick. We came back to the valley to be near her family. She had 18 months. He looked at a point on the floor. "After she was gone, I went into the lab and looked at my bench and knew the next blend I built I was going to hate, so I didn't build it. I haven't built one in 4 years." He turned the split plank over in his fingers. "There was nowhere else I was willing to be but here, where it's quiet." She nodded. She stood. She didn't touch him. She walked to the doorway and stopped with her hand on the frame. "You should have let him say your name." He understood why I asked him not to. "I know he did," she said. "He always did." And she left. Reed stood in the slant of light a long time and didn't move. 3 stories up in the management building, Desmond Holt unlocked the bottom drawer of his desk and took out a sealed envelope marked Ashford Family Trust, 2014. He looked at it the way a man looks at a debt. He put it back. Then he picked up his phone. "Move the meeting up," he said. 2 weeks is too long." Reed came home that evening to find Wren at the kitchen table again, drawing. She'd done the square-sailed boat once more, but this time she'd added a smaller boat beside it with a proper triangular sail. "That's the right rig," he said. "I know." She didn't look up. I went on the library computer. He kissed the top of her head and sat down across from her. Peanut. Yeah. Tomorrow, I'm in early. She colored in a smaller hull, careful inside the lines. Is she nice? He set the pepper grinder down with great precision. Hey, you don't have to ask me about that. She didn't look up. She finished the little sail and started in on the waterline. He watched her for a long while and didn't have the first idea what to do with the part of himself that his daughter had just seen straight through. The email came the next morning through the estate portal. 3 lines. A buyer down in Osoyos wanted to commission a custom barrel program. Cordelia wanted to walk the parameters. Could he come up to the office at 2? He came up at 2. Her office sat under a flat gray light off the water. She closed the door, and instead of going to the desk, she took one of the 2 chairs by the window and tipped her head at the other. I'm not the Cooper for a barrel program, he said. I know. Then why am I here? She didn't answer right off. She laid a folder on the low table between them and left it shut. This isn't about barrels, Reed. This is me asking if you'll come back. He sat down because something in him told him to. I'm not coming back. Why? You. He looked out at the lake. A water taxi was crossing toward the far village, throwing a long, slow wake. He'd never said any of this aloud to anyone but Gus. And Gus had gone 8 months without asking him a single question. At the end, he said, Nora was in a room I painted the color of the lake because she said she wanted to feel like she was already in the water. 8 months. I didn't build a thing. After she was gone, I went into the lab and looked at my bench, and I knew that if I built the next blend, I'd find out whether I still loved it or whether I'd ruin the part of me that could. I haven't wanted to find out. I'm still not sure I want to. Cordelia sat very still. Thank you for telling me, she said. She didn't try to talk him out of it. She didn't lean in. She put both hands flat on her knees and looked at him with a kindness that didn't ask him for anything. There was a knock, and Tobias opened the door before she could answer it. Sorry, Mr. Whitaker. Your daughter's school called the front desk. Your phone's off. Reed was on his feet. Out in the reception area, very small beside a young woman in the school cardigan, stood Wren, her backpack on. A folded permission form held in both hands. Cordelia got there before he did. She crossed the floor and crouched down to put herself at the girl's eye level and held out her hand. I'm Cordelia. You dads kept the equipment running for my family since before you were born. Wren put her hand in it. I'm Wren. I know you are. Something about a missed pickup, an early dismissal. Reed heard it and didn't hear it. He stood in the doorway and watched his daughter take a stranger's hand without first checking his face for permission, and he didn't know what to make of the loosening that went through his chest. The wildfire started up on the ridge behind Naramata on a Thursday afternoon with the wind out of the south. By 6, the smoke had crossed the lake in a brown band, and the evacuation alerts were buzzing on every phone in the valley. By 8, the gusts were running to 50, and the fire was throwing embers a half-kilometer ahead of itself. There were 40,000 vines on the lower slope and the irrigation reservoir at the top of the property, and Gus put out the call. Reed stayed. He dropped Wren with the neighbor 2 houses down and worked the early evening with whatever crew they could raise, charging the overhead sprinklers, soaking the windbreak of poplars along the north line, dragging the propane off the pad and clearing the cut grass back from the buildings. By 7:30, the first ash was falling like dirty snow. At 7:45, a set of headlights swung across the crush pad and stopped beside the shed, and Cordelia Ashford got out in fire gear. Boots, a headlamp slung round her neck. She didn't announce herself. She walked straight to the main valve manifold and started bringing the upper block lines on, working the sequence in the right order. And Gus glanced across the pad at Reed, and Reed didn't say anything at all. She worked beside them for 3 hours. She knew the property's water like she'd been raised on it because she had been, beside her father, from the time she was 9. Which lines fed which block, which fittings leaked, how to back the pressure off before a coupling blew. She spoke to Reed only to call out block numbers and where she needed hands. He spoke to her only to say, got it. Once, across the roof of the pump house with the ash coming sideways, They looked at each other through the dark and the smoke, and neither of them looked away for a count of 3. Then she called the next block, and they moved. A little after 1 in the morning, the wind backed around to the west, and the fire turned with it, climbing away to the north, up the back of the ridge, away from the lake, away from the slope. The crews that had been holding the road let their shoulders drop. By 2, the alert downgraded. The vineyard stood. The crew packed into the big shed with a pot of bad coffee, and Cordelia sat down on the bench beside Reed, her hair wet at the neck, her chest still working from the night. Neither of them said the line from the gala. Neither of them needed to. When she fell asleep against the cinder block, Gus took a fire blanket off the rack and laid it over her shoulders without a word, met Reed's eyes once, and went back to wiping the soot off his hands. By morning the lake was glass and the air smelled of wet char. That afternoon, a wine trade website ran a short item, 6 careful paragraphs, noting that the chief executive of Ashford Cellars had been seen in unusual proximity to a yard employee during a sensitive period of sale negotiations, and that certain board members were said to be uneasy about the appearance of a personal entanglement clouding the company's judgment. It didn't name Reed. It quoted an unnamed source. Cordelia read it in the back of the car coming up Highway 97, her jaw set, and didn't reply to a single message about it. At 3, she called him from her desk. "You saw it." "I saw it. If you want to step back, I won't hold it against you. I won't even ask you to explain." The line was quiet for a long time. "No, Cordelia," he said. "I said no." She closed her eyes and held the phone to her ear, listened to him breathe, and didn't trust herself to say anything for a moment. "Thank you," she said, and hung up. Across the city, in his own office, Desmond Holt read the same article on his screen and allowed himself, for the first time in 2 years, a small and precise smile. 2 days later, Reed put in a counter-proposal to the Barrel Commission. Instead of the new program, he proposed a full restoration of the Northwind, the launch her father had built, the one she'd learned the lake on, the one he himself had helped replank as a kid before he ever touched a blending bench. Cordelia approved it without a comment. Gus walked him into the storage barn and pulled the tarp the rest of the way back. The varnish had gone milky in the dark, and the bright work was dull, but the line of her was still true. Reed stood beside the cradle with his hand on the rail for a long time. Wren came down on a teacher workday and climbed onto the cradle before he could lift her up. Sat at the bow with her runners dangling over the side. "Daddy, did you really fix this boat?" "Helped to, long time ago." "Who's it for?" "Cordelia's family." She touched a rail and didn't ask anything else. Cordelia arrived in the afternoon in jeans and an old sweater, no makeup, looking like nobody's chief executive. She climbed up beside Wren at the bow without asking. Below, working a joint on the keelson, Reed could hear them. "You don't have a mom, do you?" Wren said after a while. Cordelia was quiet. "How'd you figure that out?" "Because you don't ask me about mine. People with moms always ask." Cordelia looked out at the lake. "My mom died when I was about your age." "Do you miss her?" "Every day. But I'm not sad about it anymore. I just remember her." Wren nodded slowly, the way a kid does when she's been told something true she already half knew. "Me too," she said. Below the deck, Reed sat back on his heels and rested his arm across his knee and kept his hands very still so they wouldn't hear him. That evening, Holt was waiting in the parkade when Cordelia came down, hands in his coat pockets, standing beside her car. "Vote with us, Cordelia." "No." "Then there's something about your father I'll have to make public." She unlocked the car. "Desmond, you don't have anything on my father I don't already know." He smiled the smile of a man who'd held a card a very long time. "That's because he kept it from you, not me." And he walked off across the concrete, his footsteps clapping back off the pillars, and she stood with her hand on the door handle and didn't get in for a long while. Monday morning, Gus asked her to come to the records room behind the shed and lock the door behind her. He opened the old steel safe in the corner and took out a manila envelope that had been sitting in there for 2 years. "Your dad gave me this 6 months before he passed," Gus said. Told me to put it in your hand when you were ready to read it without flinching. I've waited 2 years. I'm done waiting. She opened it at the workbench. 2 documents inside. The first was a copy of a codicil dated 2014, signed before 2 witnesses, assigning 8% of Gideon Ashford's personal shares into a private trust, the voting rights vested in one named beneficiary until 2030. The beneficiary was Reed Whittaker. The second was a letter in her father's own slanted hand. She read it standing. He'd written that he knew the board would push to sell once he was gone. He'd written that he'd chosen Reed because Reed had once turned down a great deal of money to keep the integrity of a single barrel he wasn't satisfied with. He'd written that he needed his daughter to have someone beside her who wouldn't sell the heritage for any price, and that he couldn't think of anyone else who fit. He'd written that he hadn't told her while he was alive because he didn't want her to inherit an instruction. He wanted her to find her own way to the answer. And at the bottom, if you're reading this, Gus decided you were ready. He's never once been wrong about a person. She folded the letter. She didn't cry. She put both documents back and looked at Gus. Holt knew about this. Holt was trustee of the estate. He was the one meant to notify the beneficiary. Gus's jaw worked. He never did. She nodded once and left with the envelope under her arm. She drove out of the yard and up the bench road through the orchards until she reached the little cemetery above the lake where her father was buried. And she parked and walked under the ponderoses to his stone and sat down on the grass beside it. She didn't say much. You should have told me. The wind moved in the pines. A heron stood in the shallows of the reedy bay below. She stayed an hour. She didn't hear Reed come up until he was already sitting down on the other side of the stone, and neither of them looked surprised to see the other. You come here, she said. Once a month since he went. They sat on either side of the marker and looked out at the water. He didn't tell you, Reed said after a while, because he knew you wouldn't really hear it until you needed it. You knew him better than I did. I knew 4 sides of him. You knew one I never got. Neither of them got up. When the lights started to go, they stood at the same time, walked back along the gravel together without talking, and got into separate cars. She lifted a hand off the wheel as she pulled past him. He lifted his. That night, Reed sat a long time beside Wren's bed after she'd gone under. The window cracked and the dark mountain quiet beyond it. He hadn't talked to Nora in his head in a long while. It had stopped being a thing he could do. Somewhere in the 2nd year, it had simply gone still, but sitting there, he found himself doing it again, not asking permission, only saying it the way you'd say it to someone in the next room. I think I'm going to start building again, and I think it's going to be all right. He sat there another half hour. Then he went out to the kitchen, put coffee on, and stayed up until the sky over the lake went the color of the inside of a shell. He was at the yard by 6. Gus was already there. I'll take the trust voting, Reed said. Gus looked at him over the rim of his mug. For who? For Gideon. For the 200 people who work this slope. Because she shouldn't have to stand up there alone. He paused. Not only for her, but not only the rest either. Gus set the coffee down and held out his hand, and Reed took it. By Tuesday, the trust paperwork was executed. Cordelia and Reed sat at her conference table with a list of 11 shareholders, 7 of whom might be turned. 3 days to the meeting. They spent them in rooms. Cordelia with the financials. Reed with a vision for the cellar he hadn't let himself say out loud in 4 years. A heritage estate with the winemaking program brought back to life under the Ashford name. A small premium line. The old Icon wine returned to the catalog. 240 jobs held. 18 new ones over 3 years. He talked about wine the way he talked about it at 26, without flinching once. By Thursday evening they had firm commitments from 5 of the 7. 2 were holding out. Thursday night, Wren slept on the office couch under Cordelia's coat. School was closed and the neighbor was away in Kelowna. Cordelia had laid the coat over her at some point without a word about it. At 10:30, she stood up from the table to stretch, and Reed stood too, and they ended up on the same side of it in the low light, with Wren breathing slow 10 feet away. He reached up and moved a strand of hair off Cordelia's face, and stopped with his hand still close to her cheek. She didn't move for a long count of seconds. Neither of them did a thing. He could have closed the distance. She could have lifted her chin. Neither of them did. Not yet, Reed said. I know. He stepped back. She stepped back. They sat down on opposite sides of the table and didn't speak for a minute, and then they went back to the holdout list. It was the closest either of them had come to choosing the easy thing over the right one, and they'd both chosen the right one, and they both knew it without having to put it into words. Late that night, after Reed had carried Wren out to the truck and Cordelia had locked the office behind them, she opened her laptop. Her lawyer had been working back through the old estate correspondence, and he'd forwarded one message that afternoon. From Holt to the estate's outside counsel, dated 4 months after her father's death. It read, "Do not notify trust beneficiary until I confirm. Confirmation may not come." She read it 3 times. She sent it on to her own counsel with a single line. File Friday morning, before the meeting, and closed the laptop. Friday. The boardroom on the top floor, 11 shareholders around the long table, and the board against the wall. Desmond Holt chaired. He opened with the Calverton presentation, $230 million for 60% of the estate and full control of the labels. The numbers were generous on paper. Near the end, he ran a slide that gestured at the trade website article without naming it, and let the implication sit, that the chief executive's judgment had been compromised by a personal involvement. He held on that slide a beat longer than he needed to. Cordelia stood. She wasn't theatrical about it. She walked to the head of the room and laid 3 documents on the cart beside the projector. She read the codicil aloud. She read her father's letter aloud, and her voice held the whole way through. Then she put the 3rd page up on the screen, Holt's 4-year-old email to outside counsel, instructing them to bury the notification of a trust beneficiary. The room went very quiet. An older shareholder named Edmund Crane, gray-headed, a friend of the family since before Cordelia was born, leaned forward. Desmond. Tell me that's not what it looks like. Holt said nothing. Crane looked at the table, then at Cordelia, and sat back. Reed stood up from the far end of the room. He didn't raise his voice, and he didn't lead with anger. He laid out the plan he and Cordelia had built over 3 days. The heritage estate kept whole. The winemaking program reopened under the Ashford name. 240 jobs held. 18 positions added over 3 years. The premium line and the returning icon wine projected to clear within 5. He spoke for 9 minutes, and he spoke about wine the way a man does when he's been quiet about something too long. He finished by saying, "Gideon trusted me not to sell this. I'm not going to sell it. And Ms. Bran, Ashford shouldn't have to stand up here on her own anymore. That's all I've got." And he sat down. The vote went by shares. Cordelia's 31%, Reed's 8% of trust, Crane's 12%. 3 more came across. The total against the Calverton bid landed at 62%, and the motion died on the table. Crane, as senior shareholder, moved that Desmond Holt be removed as chairman effective immediately, pending civil action by the estate for breach of fiduciary duty. The vote was unanimous but for the one. Holt stood, gathered his papers, looked at no one, and walked out. He stopped at the elevators with his phone buzzing in his hand. A reporter wanting confirmation, and let it ring, and stepped into the car when the doors opened. 30 years in the trade, and he rode down alone. When the room had cleared, Crane came over and put a hand on Cordelia's arm. "Your father would have been proud of how you did that." "Thank you," she said. "He'd have liked you saying so." Then it was just the 2 of them at the long table, and outside the window the lake was full of light. "We should get out of this room," she said. He stood. They walked out together. That evening, they ate at Reed's house above Naramata. Cordelia brought an apple pie she'd made in her own kitchen that afternoon, between calls with the lawyer, the crust gone a little dark at the edges. Wren ate 2 pieces and said nothing about the edges. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and the cold stone smell off the lake. Wren talked about school. The class was studying the lake, and the teacher had taught them the fish that lived in it, and Cordelia named 4 of them right, including the kokanee her own father had taught her when she was Wren's age. Wren looked at her with a quiet kind of wonder. After the dishes, Wren went off to brush her teeth without being told. Reed stood with the towel in his hand a beat longer than the job needed. "What?" Cordelia said. She used to need 3 reminders. "How long since?" "Tonight's the first time." Cordelia didn't answer that. She took up the towel and started drying. 6 weeks on, the last Saturday in November, the valley caught a warm spell. A light north wind. A sky the color of a clean shell. Holt had resigned the board outright 2 weeks before. The civil case had been filed and was grinding through discovery. The Calverton bid was formally withdrawn. Crane had been named interim chair. The winemaking program at Ashford Cellars would reopen in February under Reed Whitaker, with a clause written into it for school pickup. Wren had started in the youth paddling program at the community sailing club down the lake. Cordelia had filled out the registration 2 weeks back without being asked. That morning the north wind went back in the water. A small thing, no press. The crew, Gus, Reed, Cordelia, and Wren in a properly fitted life jacket cinched snug under her chin. Because Reed had checked the straps twice before her runners left the dock. There was a tradition Gideon had taught him 12 years ago. The maker marked the hull with one small word before a launch. Reed handed Wren the grease pencil. She sat down on the dock and wrote her name in small, careful letters on the underside of the gunwale, in a spot only she would ever know was there. Wren was here. He looked at it and didn't rub it off. They launched her cleaned. The line of her was still true. Gus had been right 12 years ago. It was the finest thing the slope ever turned out. Reed took the tiller, and Cordelia stood beside him, and Wren sat amidships with her hands flat on her own knees, watching the water go by. They came out past the point into the open lake, the wind steady, the sail full. Wren wasn't looking at either of them. She was watching an osprey work the shallows off the far shore. "Daddy," she said. "Yeah, Peanut? Is Cordelia coming sailing with us again?" Reed kept his hand on the tiller and his eye on the telltale and didn't look over at the woman beside him. "I was hoping she would," he said. Cordelia kept looking out at the water. She didn't turn her head. She smiled the small, private smile of a person who has just heard the exact thing she'd been waiting on. "I will," she said. And Wren nodded once, satisfied, and went back to watching the osprey drop. None of the 3 of them said the line from the night of the gala again. None of them needed to. The answer had been given weeks ago on a back porch above the lake, and it had just been given again now, in the smaller voice of a child who'd already heard everything she needed to hear. The bow held its line out toward the open water. The sun came higher over the hills, and the dock behind them was already small. What stays with me about Reed Whitaker isn't the boardroom or the vote. It's the 4 years he spent fixing tractors in the quiet, refusing to touch the work that had once been his whole life. He didn't drink himself under, and he didn't make a scene of his grief. He just got up every morning and did honest work and raised his girl, and because he stayed decent in the small invisible hours, he was already the kind of man Gideon Ashford had bet the whole estate on. That's the part people miss. The trust didn't reward a clever play. It rewarded years of nobody was watching integrity. The sort you build long before there's anything to win by it. I keep coming back to the choice he and Cordelia made at that conference table, 10:30 at night, Wren asleep, 10 feet away. They could have closed the distance and let the article be right about them. Instead, they stepped back. It would have been easy to grab the comfort and let it cost them the credibility they needed 3 days later. Holt was counting on them being weak enough to hand him that. They weren't, and that quiet bit of self-discipline is what let Cordelia stand up Friday morning with clean hands and read her father's letter without anyone able to throw mud back. Doing the harder right thing in private is what made the public win possible. Cause and effect, plain as anything. And I think about how much of this turned on Cordelia simply being willing to look. She could have signed the Calverton deal, taken the easy number, and never asked who really blended the north wind. But she paid attention. She read the room, read the photograph, read the silence around Reed's name. And she chased the truth even when it sat her down on a coil of rope and knocked the wind out of her. That kind of patience-seeing, refusing the simple story when a truer, harder one is sitting right there, is its own form of strength. Most people don't lose to villains like Holt. They lose because they'd rather not know. The grit came last, and it came from both of them. 3 days, 11 shareholders, a fire on the ridge, a daughter who just started letting someone new in. They were tired and exposed, and they kept going anyway. Not for a grand prize, but for 240 people on a slope and a boat under a tarp that deserved to float again. Gus waited 2 years to hand over an envelope because he trusted the long game. Reed waited 4 years to draw the next line because he wasn't going to fake it. Good things, the real ones, almost never come fast. They come to the people who are still standing, still honest, still paying attention when the moment finally turns.